Perfect. Hello, NCIA members and supporters, and welcome to another edition of NCIA's Industry Essentials Educational Webinar Series. NCIA's Industry Essentials are our new weekly educational series featuring a variety of programs, allowing us to provide you timely, engaging, and essential education when you need it the most. My name is Brian Gilbert, the events manager here at NCIA, and I'm very pleased to introduce yet another fantastic educational opportunity for you all this afternoon. We have a great session lined up as our Risk Management Committee presents a follow-up presentation on their previous webinar surrounding novel risk during the COVID-19 crisis. If you're just joining, please note that we will be conducting a moderated Q&A session at the conclusion of the presentation. So if you have any questions for the panelists, don't hesitate to pose them by either using the Q&A feature available along the bottom toolbar. This will allow our panelists to answer questions in real time, or by sending them as a message inside the chat room to all panelists or everyone in the meeting, and our team will compile them for discussion. Last week, our Risk Management Committee hosted an enlightening conversation regarding how cannabis operators could mitigate the risk that the coronavirus presents to their customers, their employees, and their businesses. This week, another panel of experts will follow up on that presentation by discussing how cannabis operators can mitigate the financial risk presented by the coronavirus. A huge thank you to all the NCIA members joining us this afternoon. And with that, please enjoy today's session entitled NCIA Committee Insights, Managing Novel Risks During the COVID-19 Crisis Part 2. What you need to know about SBA, CARES Act, and other financial assistance programs. Being moderated by Summer Jenkins, Senior Product Development Manager at founding NCIA member, Cannabis Insurance Services. Take it away, Summer.
Hi, thank you so much for the introduction. We are all very happy to participate in this discussion today. This is part 2 of the Risk Management Insurance Committee's production of Managing Risk. And we're going to be discussing the nuances of the novel risks experienced by business owners post-COVID-19. We're going to go over the financial aspects of SBA and the CARES Act. And we have a panel of experts. Politically, we have Michelle Rudder. She's the Deputy Director of Government Relations for NCIA. And when I asked her, why is she here? Why does she do what she does every day? She told me that she is passionate about cannabis. She believes that everyone should have access, and she wants to kill the stigma that's associated with cannabis, its users, via her lobbying efforts. So thank you so much for participating today, Michelle. We also have Christopher Davis, who is our legal expert. He's the Executive Director of the International Cannabis Bar Association. Chris has an interesting background, being that he started in New York finance, and he attended an event while in school that included other professionals that operated in the cannabis space, and they changed his viewpoint. He said that they were some of the most professional, well-educated, and impressive professionals in the legal industry that he had ever seen. And he actually volunteered his time until they hired him. So thank you so much for participating today, Chris. And then we also have Kevin. Kevin is a buddy of mine who is also a colleague. He has always impressed me with his professionalism and his passion for cannabis. He is full name Kevin Howler, CPA and principal at Akeem Consulting. He is personally passionate about cannabis, is a longtime cannabis activist and consumer, and he said that he is proud to be part of cannabis history. And he enjoys helping change the narrative using his professionalism and financial expertise. So thank you, Kevin. And my name is Summer Jenkins. I have been a professional in the commercial insurance industry for 22 years. The past 3 to 4 years, I've been specializing in cannabis. So my firm is Cannabis Insurance Services, LLC, operating out of Cleveland, Ohio. I, however, work out of my lovely home office here in sunny California. And I believe that the cannabis industry should be for all, something that we can all capitalize on. And I believe that plants heal. So that is why I'm here. And I want to help use whatever resources and insights I have to change the narrative that is currently experienced in business and professionalism. You know, there are not many people of color. There are not many formerly poor people. There are not a whole lot of women. So equity is another personal, I guess, value set that I subscribe to. And I also am proud to be the executive or the director of equity and inclusion for the Cannabis Creators Association of California. So with that, we can jump right in. Kevin, I want to start with you. So during this discussion, we're going to be using a lot of acronyms. Acronyms are things that we hear in our profession and in every profession. They have a list of, you know, a bunch of letters that we string together. So if you could start out for us and just tell our viewers what is SBA? What does that stand for? CARES Act, you know, some of the other acronyms that we're going to be using. If you can throw them out there and just let us know what they mean.
Yeah, thank you so much, Summer, and thank you, NCIA, for having me. So CARES Act is the overall intent is to provide emergency assistance and health care response to individuals, families, and businesses affected by the 2020 coronavirus. And SBA is the Small Business Administration that administers the loans that are a component of the CARES Act. These loans are not available to cannabis business and even indirect cannabis businesses. And I know Chris will kind of get into that a little bit more. But ultimately, the relief is intended, as it said, to kind of keep people employed and keep the economy going. So it's incredibly important that every business, every individual has access to these programs. And there are some things we'll discuss that are available to all businesses, even cannabis businesses, but the loans, the big one, are not. And I don't know if you want me to jump into some of those things right now, Summer, that are and aren't. Just let me know.
So before that, Kevin, could you break down the CARES Act? What does it include? I know there's another acronym, PPP, EIDL. Let's just set a quick framework for the meaning of those things before we dive into the details, if we could.
Two main loans are the PPP loan, you might have heard of. That's a payroll protection program loan. The other one is the economic injury disaster loan, or EIDL, E-I-D-L. Those are the two loan programs. Then underneath, there's, you know, payroll tax credits and deferrals programs. There's even some net operating losses changes where the rules were before they were limited and you couldn't carry them back. They've added some of those. There's other things where they changed qualified improvement property from 39 years to 15 years. So we're going to discuss that, where it might be advantageous to amend past returns. However, cannabis businesses are not allowed to take accelerated depreciation. So even though some businesses might be able to amend returns to lower that useful life and take advantage of accelerated depreciation, cannabis cannot. So those are just some of the many. However, this is evolving on an hourly basis. So you read up last week, you're already behind on what currently is. Then on the loan side, there are forgivable components to the loans. However, they haven't even fully defined what that is. And they haven't defined whether or not businesses will be able to take advantage of the deductions, you know, because if you received a loan to pay for payroll and rent, and if they haven't decided whether or not you will be able to take those deductions or not. So it's kind of interesting that everyone rushed to get money. There's more rounds of money coming. However, this thing is just, you know, we're learning as we go, and that's just kind of how it is right now, as they're quickly trying to get funds to businesses to keep people employed.
Okay. So it sounds like it's something that's continually evolving. Michelle, with the CARES Act, can you tell us where that originated? You know, with the fact that it's not currently available to cannabis businesses, you know, what could a business owner do to affect change in that area?
Sure. Thanks, Summer, and happy to be here with everybody. So there's an interesting reason why cannabis businesses aren't eligible for some of these funds, and it's not solely because of cannabis's Schedule I status in the Controlled Substances Act, though it does relate back to that, of course. So back in 2018, the SBA, or the Small Business Administration, don't forget we'll be using a lot of acronyms. Sorry if you heard my dog growl there. He just came in from his walk. This is how it is working from home in the age of coronavirus. So, but he has a lot to say about the SBA as well. So getting back to the SBA, though, they came out in 2018 and with some new guidance that essentially define what a direct marijuana business is and what an indirect marijuana business is. So, of course, a direct marijuana business is someone who is plant touching, right? So you're a cultivator, you're a manufacturer, you're a dispensary, but they define those indirect marijuana businesses differently, and that's where we sort of have the crux of the problem that we're in right now. So with the way the SBA defined an indirect marijuana business, they essentially said, and Chris, of course, our legal expert here, can talk to people a little bit more about this as well, but they essentially said that if you're deriving a good chunk of your income from a direct marijuana business, then you are now considered an indirect marijuana business. And so when things like the Families First Act and the CARES Act first came out a couple weeks ago, now I guess getting close to a month ago now, the Small Business Administration was, of course, contacted by many of us in the industry, and they did reiterate that was their position, that both direct marijuana businesses, but also those indirect marijuana businesses, are not eligible for some of these different loans and funds that we've talked about, PPP loans, EIDL loans, and Chris and Kevin will dive more into that. So that's why we're sort of in the bind that we're in currently. It's important to note with this, though, that the SBA came out and did this sort of on their own in 2018. This wasn't a definition that has been passed legislatively. This was not something that was done by Congress. This was a bureaucrat over at the SBA who came up with this. And so I think it's important too that, for better or for worse, that we're just sort of in this bad position by the result of a sort of arcane definition, if you will, which we all know that all too well in this industry. So, but getting back to your original question too, what can people do? What can business owners do if you're home right now and you're upset about what's happening? If you haven't already gotten in touch with your member of Congress and your senators, number one, that is what you need to do. Just with how it is in the cannabis industry, many of us are located in similar areas. So, we have a lot of NCIA members in Denver who have Diana DeGette as their congresswoman. Then we have a lot of members, for instance, in the San Francisco area. You have Congresswoman Barbara Lee on this. So if you're in an area like that, just because you have someone who's supportive of this issue doesn't mean you should not call. You should call them and thank them if you're aware that they have, for instance, signed on to some of the letters about this issue, and I know we're going to talk more about that in a little bit. But if they have done something on this issue, or they're great on this issue, call them, thank them, and tell them that you still need their help, though, that the job is not over, and that cannabis industry businesses need to be included in the next coronavirus relief package. And especially do that if you do not live somewhere like Denver or Oakland or elsewhere, and be sure to call your senators as well. And I'll throw in some other ways, again, when we start talking about more specific efforts around legislation and letters about what you can call specifically about, but call your legislators, tweet at them, get in touch with them, however you want to.
So just engage any way you can. So
absolutely.
In that vein, really quickly, does the NCIA offer any assistance? So is there a place that someone interested can look to see if maybe they're not, is experienced with writing letters, don't know what to say? Is there some guidance offered by NCIA?
Absolutely. You can visit our website, thecannabisindustry.org, Google us, however you want to get there. We have a whole COVID-19 page. We also have a link to not only find your legislator, but some draft about what you can actually say to them. And that page also has just a great number of resources about information that Chris and Kevin are going to talk about, some of our other great partners in the industry that they've come out with. But just visit our website at thecannabisindustry.org.
Okay, great. So now when everyone gets all upset and their feathers ruffled about what we say, they know what they can do. Thank you, Michelle. So Chris, back to you. We heard about direct businesses and indirect businesses. So direct businesses are businesses that touch flower, plant, product, right? And indirect are more ancillary services that I guess provide a service to the direct business. What are the differences in the availability for CARES Act for direct businesses and indirect businesses?
Sure. First of all, I want to reiterate what Michelle was saying. Contact your representatives no matter where you are. We just had a call with Barbara Lee here in the East Bay in Oakland on 4/20, actually. She's very receptive to what we had to say, but there's always a problem about communicating nuances to our representatives, and they always need to understand more than what they currently do. So it's always very helpful to get on the phone with the constituents and sort of communicate the problems on the ground that we're experiencing, because that's how you get a lot of those responses. And if you need help setting those up, if you need talking points, of course, the INCBA is always happy to help. Michelle at the NCIA is a great resource. And so, you do have those tools. In terms of speaking about what type of relief may be available to cannabis market participants and sort of those ancillary businesses, those of us who support the cannabis industry through professional services, there is a delineation between this idea of direct marijuana businesses and indirect marijuana businesses. I personally hate that delineation. I know a lot of people sort of cringe when they hear that, especially on calls like this. That is, as Michelle mentioned, sort of a creation of a set of bureaucrats that are not subject to the voters' whims. They're sitting in a back room at the SBA and the Small Business Administration and coming up with these regulations. And what they've done is they have divided the industry sort of into two different buckets. As we mentioned, we think about those direct marijuana industry participants. Those are the direct businesses, the plant-touching individuals. Those indirect businesses are actually anyone that receives a direct payment from a direct business, from a direct marijuana business. And so, unfortunately, contrary to what Michelle just mentioned, it's not even a good sum of money. The way that the regulations are written is actually if you receive any money from one of these direct businesses, you fall into this indirect category. And so if you're an attorney and you're providing legal services to a whole bunch of different industries, and one of your clients walks in the door and they want 2 hours of work done for a direct marijuana company, all of a sudden that law firm has become an indirect marijuana business and they fall under this guidance. So it's easy to trigger, and unfortunately the consequences of becoming one of those indirect businesses, or as I like to call them, sort of cannabis adjacent professionals, is pretty stringent. And so I actually want to start with the sort of the three major provisions of relief that are available under the CARES Act. And the first one is actually sort of on the front end of that. It's before we get into this delineation of indirect versus direct businesses. And again, sort of referencing back to what Summer and Kevin were saying, the problems that we're now facing are sort of a combination of historical problems that we've faced with policy issues in the industry. So issues with taxation coming out of 280E, and then also issues with the Safe Banking Act. And so Michelle, obviously, she, some of you may know that she named the Safe Banking Act. So that's sort of one of her pet projects, but fixing some of those longstanding regulatory and policy issues that exist. And so it's the combination of existing policy with prior policy that's really creating some of these issues. To start at the beginning, the one piece of relief that is available to the cannabis industry, to the people that are on this call, is the payroll tax credit. This is only available to those indirect ancillary businesses. And so nothing that we talk about today that was administered under the CARES Act is going to be available to those direct businesses. But please keep listening, because of course we are fighting to make this available, and a lot of these sort of conditions will be important down the road as the next set of legislation comes up. With the payroll tax credit, that's administered by the IRS. So that means that that is subject to our old friend 280E. This is something that Kevin, I think, will talk about a little bit later in the presentation. The payroll tax credit allows companies to get some of that money back that they would have been, paying through in salaries for their employers. Unfortunately, the payroll tax credit and the PPP program are mutually exclusive. So if you get this payroll tax credit, you wouldn't be able to apply for the PPP program anyway. So please do, if you are an indirect cannabis business, if you are a business that does not have to worry about filing requirements related to 280E, if you are not subject to those sort of requirements, then you can apply for this payroll tax credit, and you should be eligible for that. And so please look into that. If you're not one of these quote unquote direct businesses, if you're not a flower touching business, look into that payroll tax credit.
Okay. So yeah, that's a really good point. So before we go too deep into that, Kevin, can you tell us about 280E and the implications there?
Yeah, I'll do a high level on that. But again, just real quick on Chris's point, any gross revenue in the past year from a direct marijuana business defines you as an indirect. And I just want to point out taxes paid by this industry, and they paid $4.7 billion in federal taxes, I believe, in 2017 alone. Well, taxes to the federal government is their revenue. So by definition, the federal government is an indirect marijuana business as well. I just want to point that out. So there's a lot of hypocrisy within this, and we have to call attention to that because it's important. 280, and there's another misconception because I want to point out that cannabis was deemed essential in many areas. And that was a huge win for cannabis, and they were excited, and some people tried to slap them down like they don't need help because they're deemed essential and they're bragging about it. I will say that this industry has been just striving for acceptance. The people involved in this industry are passionate about the plant, passionate about the industry. And when everything happened recently, it was a huge win that the country supported the fact that cannabis is needed for the consumers. And so I wanted to point that out. Now 280E, on the other hand, these businesses aren't bankrolling as people think because they're staying open, because 280E is devastating. And the more you move down the supply chain from seed to sale, 280E becomes more cumbersome. So if you are a retailer, you ultimately have roughly an effective tax rate of 80% at the federal level, because all you can deduct is the product you bought and the transportation to get that in to your facility. So your facility is not deductible. If you're delivering your cars, your drivers are not deductible. Your bud tenders, none of these are deductible. And now that you're essential business, you have to incur cost and pivot to get SOPs in place to ensure that you are not putting your consumers or your employees at risk as you're out there administering product to the consumers. And so you're incurring even more cost that's not deductible. So ultimately 280E is for people that deal in trafficking a Schedule I illegal substance, which cannabis still is considered. And so really all you can deduct is cost of goods sold, and that's pretty much a reduction in your gross receipts, but all business deductions are non-deductible. So it's challenging for me because I find, because of that rule, most people focused on how do I navigate 280E? And it put the focus, in my opinion, in the wrong place, because businesses should focus on managing, like first off, understanding the numbers, but managing their top line and managing their expenses, not trying to come up with creative ways to skirt a rule that by design is pretty harsh, and there's no real skirting it. It is what it is. It's the cost of doing business. And it's important, in my opinion, that cannabis is descheduled, because this industry can't thrive. And to your point earlier, Summer, equity is important to a lot of us in many ways in this industry. And it just you can't put out a thriving business because the cost to enter and navigate while 280 exists is just far too high. And there's a difference between producers and retailers in terms of what's deductible. Of course, a producer has much more expenses that meet the definition of cost of goods sold than retail. So vertical integration is key, having a component in the production side. If you're straight retail or distribution, hopefully you have access to deep wells that will not dry up until we can get cannabis rescheduled.
Thank you. That's all very, very helpful. So Chris, can you tell me what the legal implications are if, a plant touching business applies for one of these assistance programs that they're not legally eligible for?
So it depends on what program you're under. As Kevin mentioned, 280E basically prohibits any tax credit or deduction that is related to trafficking a scheduled narcotic. Cannabis remains a Schedule I narcotic on the federal level. That means that neither one of those would be available, neither a credit nor a deduction. So Kevin was talking about the deduction side. This payroll credit program would be that credit, obviously. Mm-hmm. And so that would be, you would be misfiling your taxes. So you would be subject to any sort of normal penalties that you would otherwise be subject to for either tax fraud or for intentionally misfiling your taxes or a statement to the When we're talking about the other two programs, and so those other two programs, so we have the payroll protection, or sorry, not the payroll protection, the payroll tax credit is administered by the IRS, and so that's why it's subject to 280E sort of off on its own. The other two programs are administered by the SBA. The other two programs are, as we mentioned, they're the PPP program, which is the payroll protection program, and the EIDL loan, so the Economic Injury Disaster Relief, EIDL loans. Those are both administered by the SBA. The SBA, in its standard operating procedure, so this is what we're talking about when we're saying people that were not subject to sort of legislative intent, it was in their standard operating procedure, that's where the delineation between these direct marijuana businesses, plant touching businesses, and indirect businesses, those that have received a payment from a direct business, comes up. And so with the PPP program, it says that neither those direct or indirect businesses are eligible for these PPP loans. When you're making your application to a bank to get one of these loans, you have to certify in that application that, one, you're not breaking any federal laws, and two, you're otherwise eligible for these SBA loans. In that standard operating procedure, it's a little bit hard to find if you're not a lawyer. Honestly, it took some digging for us to sort of figure out where this all came from. But you know, it turns out that that would be it could be interpreted to be a miscertification if you certified that you were eligible. If you are ineligible for these loans, there's two sort of interesting factors here. One is that my impression that this was a sort of a remnant of the 2008 financial crisis. Banks were sort of, you know, they were tasked with getting that stimulus out in a very efficient, effective manner. You know, they made some mistakes in getting that out, and they turned on into some, they ran into some liability on the back end for sort of miswriting those TARP bailout loans in 2008. So one of the conditions of them administering this set of financial relief was that they did not want to be liable for giving these loans out to the wrong people. So what our legislature did was they passed that underwriting liability onto the ultimate borrower through those certifications. So the ultimate borrower is certifying that they're eligible for these loans. If they are ineligible for these loans, that can come with criminal penalties, unfortunately. The potential criminal penalties could be 2, 5, or even up to 30 years in prison based on the False Claims Act. So if you're making a false claim to a federally insured depository institution, that can come with some pretty strict penalties, unfortunately. So I would not recommend miscertifying if you know that this is not going to be a truthful certification. On the other hand, we've seen a lot of problems with oversight of this. So we've seen Donald Trump fire a few inspector generals over the last few weeks. Some of those had to do with the medical side. Some of those had to do with bailout oversight side. We're also seeing sort of a ramp up in the fraud department of you know, the SBA and the people that are administering these loans, because we've seen a ton of businesses that are either overstating their payroll, or they're overstating their rent, or overstating their other expenses to get higher amounts of loans that they're then applying for forgiveness. And so honestly, we don't know where we're going to fall in terms of the priority here, right? So we don't know if this is going to be worse than one of those companies that misstates their sort of basic payroll and is trying to get more money from the federal government than not, or whether, you know, if you misstate and you're coming from the cannabis industry, whether that's going to be looked at as sort of the worst, you know, the worst of the two evils. And so we really don't know where we lie on this priority. And so it could be that no one ever gets prosecuted for this and no one ever gets in trouble for it. It could be that there is a huge amount of liability out there and a bunch of people will get prosecuted. And then just to throw one more wrinkle into this, we do also have the Joyce Blumenauer Amendment, which many of the people on the phone know prevents the federal government from using federal dollars through the Department of Justice to prosecute federal crimes that would interfere with the implementation of a state legal medical marijuana program. And so there is also a possibility that maybe the federal government will be prohibited from enforcing these measures because they can't use money to go after, you know, what would inhibit the implementation of a state legal medical program. So really, there's a lot of gray area. There is some liability that's associated with this. There's potential criminal liability, but at the same time, we don't know where we lie on that priority schedule. And then there are also potentially some affirmative defenses there. And so it's really a big question mark.
Bottom line is here. You've thrown a lot of really useful information, and I'm just looking here at the composition of our viewers, right? So we have ancillary businesses, we have retail, we have manufacturers, we have some cultivators, So, what would be the bottom line for, and then we have, a bunch of professional resources. What would be the bottom line for each one of these when thinking about the whole certification process?
Sure.
What do we need to know to manage that risk?
The bottom line is you should contact an attorney that you feel comfortable with. You should talk to them. You shouldn't necessarily trust your bank because your bank's underwriter doesn't necessarily know what they're talking about. And like I said, those certification liabilities are passed on to you. So you could walk into your bank could say, this looks great, let's apply for this loan. And then when it turns around and someone starts getting in trouble for it, that you said, well, my banker said it was fine. And they're going to say, we don't care. And so don't trust your banker necessarily. Find a good lawyer that you trust. If you are a cultivator, if you're anywhere in that sort of plant touching sphere, I would recommend that you look to your state to look for state sort of past measures. Here in California, I think it's AB 1948, which was introduced by Rob Bonta. There is a proposal to eliminate the cultivation tax, postpone and reduce some of the licensing fees. And so there are sort of state level programs, but if you are a plant touching business, I would not apply for a federal relief under the CARES Act. I would not, sort of be very careful. And then one of the other considerations that we really do have to take into account here is there's sort of two hurdles that we have to pass when we're going through getting one of these loans, either through the PPP program or the EIDL program, and that's getting through the SBA, which we've already talked about. That's very difficult with the indirect versus direct marijuana business. Neither one of those is eligible for either one of these loans. But then you have to go through your bank as well, right? And so the bank issue is an existing issue that we've run into for decades in this industry. We're trying to fix it with the Safe Banking Act. But that banking relationship is a very important aspect of our businesses that are operating under a regulatory system in a state. And so if you are going into your bank and you're potentially miscertifying something, think very carefully about whether or not you can afford to lose that banking relationship, because in many instances, that is just as valuable as a lot of the other things that we're talking about here.
Awesome. So that ties us into one other thing that I do want to bring up too here. And it looks like we're at about the halfway point. So I do want to take a couple of questions. And I do want to come back to that banking issue as well. So question, and any one of you lovely guests can answer this. This is from an anonymous attendee. Do you think that states need to step in and provide a state level alternative to the PPP? Live case, Massachusetts.
I think absolutely. States have been pushing to get it legalized in their state because of the tremendous benefit that, cannabis being legal in a state brings to that state in terms of revenue. So I believe, if you've benefited from this industry, you have an obligation to kind of ensure the industry thrives in your state. We all seem to forget that the illicit market has been supporting this industry for decades, and the consumers all know the illicit market operators. So if the state doesn't support the legal businesses, they run the risk of folding, but cannabis will still be sold in this country. Period. So,
and then talk about a public health issue on your hands when you start pushing people back to the illicit market, right?
Absolutely. We remember the vape crisis. There's no regulations around that. So things are moving forward and we need to be forward thinking. And again, the whole intent of this program was to keep people employed. We're over 30 million unemployed people and counting in this industry employs 250,000 people just in direct. We can't even quantify the indirect and how many people benefit from this. And if everyone was honest on the indirect, most business in this country benefits some way, shape, or form. Hotels.
Absolutely right.
That's
absolutely right. And just another sort of point there, and I know that I'm talking a lot about California. One of the reasons is because this moves so quickly at this point that it's hard to keep track of states where you're not directly sitting in. But here in California, they are also coming up with sort of an economic stimulus working group at the state level. In California, I believe that there are 40,000 direct employees, and cannabis businesses do not have a seat at that table. And so we have 40,000 employees in the state, direct employees, and we are not a part of the economic stimulus talks on the state level. So that's a problem. We need to continue to push to make sure that we're heard here. Like Kevin said, those indirect businesses are multiples the time of, how big that direct industry is. So it's very, very important to get this through on the state level. And then also states are the ones that are deeming us as an essential service, right?
Right.
So that is happening on the state level. And if the state is going to say that we're an essential service and that we're allowed to remain open in this very, very interesting time, they need to turn around and offer us the economic support that we need to survive.
Yeah, and I don't really think there's any question. I think unequivocally the answer, the simple short answer to this question that was posed is yes. But unfortunately, like we all know, as are many things, and again, cannabis and policy, it's not as easy as it looks. And like you said, Summer, I don't want to jump the gun. I know we're going to get to banking here in a minute, but just to color a little bit of the conversations that I've been having on the political side of things, NCIA has been working not only on our own, but also with other associations and lobbyists in this space. And a couple of weeks ago, we worked with our friends, a couple different groups, the Global Alliance for Cannabis Commerce, the Minority Cannabis Business Association, the National Cannabis Roundtable, Cannabis Trade Federation, some other groups as well. And we had we sent about 100 different letters all over. We sent some state treasurers letters. We sent some letters about medical access and about these essential businesses and making sure that there's provisions, things like curbside delivery and whatnot in place to make these transactions as safe as possible. But getting back to it, we had, I don't want to name the state here, but we did send pretty much all medical and adult use states, state treasurers a letter that was imploring them to talk to their congressional delegation about this issue, to bring that message back up to Washington, to sort of force that narrative upwards. But then also we asked them in their states, please, if there's any relief that you can give, we know that these businesses need it, please do so. And we actually got a response from that. And this treasurer's office says, we don't have the authority to issue the loans directly, but we're working with a number of financial institutions to make treasury funds available to them at zero interest rates in order to facilitate loans at an affordable rate to small businesses. But most financial institutions are shying away from cannabis and cannabis affiliated businesses at the moment, but we're trying to work with one to do so. And so again, I think this is just really enforcing that narrative that even at the state level, these officials, like you said, Kevin, they've been accepting this tax money. They know that this is going to do, if anything, help their states during this time that's going to become, a budget shortfall, as well as a multitude of other, financial issues that everyone is going to incur. And so, but the fact of the matter is that it's not just that easy as, oh, well, the federal government's now given some money to the states. Can't the states allocate it? It's just, unfortunately, not that simple.
Right.
There are some things available at state level. For example, California delayed paying sales tax up to 50 grand. Think of it as a loan. And excise tax delayed 90 days. So there's certain things where they're deferring payments, but you just have to be mindful that you're going to have to pay those. So again, retail with the sales tax, you're hammered the most. You use that money, you got to make sure you have it when it's come due in a year.
So Kevin, that was a perfect segue into my next question for you. As far as what is available, and you said something about a kind of a financial pivot, right? So, in the essence of all the conditions, I almost said proposed, but more like imposed on business owners today because of COVID-19, what, from a financial risk management point, would you say are some of the most meaningful things that business owners can do to help themselves stay afloat, and things that they should probably be mindful of that they may not know?
Yeah, I would think number one right now is really focusing on CDC and state requirements for how to maintain social distancing and operate a business right now. We haven't seen, no one's going to be able to say, I got coronavirus there. But if your business isn't following best practices and someone does get affected, they're going to be able to call out your business. So I would say that people need to pivot and really be mindful that you got to stay cutting edge in terms of where you're utilizing the money. One thing I've said since the beginning too of this industry being birthed again is don't focus on 280E, focus on your processes and your accounting and your top line. Accounting has always been like the redheaded stepchild of this industry where it wasn't a priority to put your money in. However, the numbers tell the story, and it's so important to build that foundation of processes and accounting because right now is critical in terms of pivots. You can't forecast and make changes if you don't have reliable accounting information. Right now, we're on the brink of an automation revolution, and nothing's going to spin that more forward than maintaining social distancing. I mean, we're going to see things change from here going forward. And so it's important for people to have processes, have accounting in place, focus on their top line, managing their costs, and not trying to just circumvent 280E. We're going to do I'm doing another webinar on the Treasury report, but I would urge anyone who's in this industry to look at that, because what we thought was going to happen is inevitably going to happen. And 59% of returns filed in Washington, Oregon, and California had errors and adjustments that will be material back taxes.
Say that again, Kevin.
What's that?
You say that last part again?
Say that again. Twice more.
Say it again.
The taxes are going to be astronomical. In those 3 states, there was tremendous errors of non-compliance with 280E. That's what they can focus on, because I know there's banking, but banking's been limited. They're not going to really focus on tracing through revenue. It's going to be compliance with cost of goods sold. And the regulators can easily point to the law. I mean, they don't like this industry because the law says it's illegal. The second that changes, their tune will change. But in the meantime, they can say, we don't have to. And there's case law now that supports you can't do the crazy complex structure to navigate 280E. There's no circumventing it. Your best efforts is to follow it, to have lean processes in place, and to focus on top line. So focus on what you're producing, assessing your costs and your processes to see how you can be more efficient. Those are the keys right now. Plus, I mean, right now we're going to see industries collapse and industries merge and rise. So it's definitely uncertain, crazy times. And really, the numbers are incredibly important for people to understand how to pivot. And without that information, you're not going to make an educated guess on how to pivot.
Can I just add 2 things quickly, Summer? First of all, I want to reiterate that second point you made. We've seen a huge ramp up in the IRS 280E committee. And so we're expecting a lot of audits to come down the pipeline this year. And so it's a messy world. It's a messy sort of terrain to navigate between 280E and the interaction of 280E and your state taxes. It's just a nightmare. So get ready. If you don't have a good accountant, please find one, because this is going to be a tough year for audits. As soon as this COVID thing passes, fingers crossed, knock on wood, we're going to have another thing to run into. So the writing's on the wall. And then Kevin also mentioned the idea of liability here for businesses that have been deemed critical and that are remaining open, and sort of the need to keep in place social distancing measures. This is another sort of unseen, it's a huge blind spot in terms of liability for not only for our industry, but for every critical business out there, every business that has been deemed essential. They have employees that are going in and that are being exposed to the coronavirus. It's just a fact of life. We know that at this point. We don't know whether the causation will be there. We don't know whether employers will be able to be held liable for that. But there is this fight that's coming out in a lot of the right and left wing sort of federal policy making around employees and hazard pay and employers and who is going to be forced to pay for workers' comp. Being deemed an essential business is not a license to act negligently. If you expose your employees or your customers to a negligent, undue risk of obtaining, getting COVID, that could be a huge piece of hidden liability. So if you're critical, if you're an essential business, you're staying open, make sure that you're following your county guidelines. If you're right on the county border and the county next door to you is completely shut down and they have very stringent guidelines, but your county is like, go play in the street, maybe you want to pay attention to those next door county guidelines, because maybe you need to sort of pay attention to what duty of care is being established in sort of your very, very narrow locality. And so just pay attention to what's going on around you, and don't be negligent with your employees' health, with your customers' health. Be very careful there.
And document everything. Right now we are all in a state of flux. So no one's really sure where the law is going to land. The different legalities are different in each state, each municipality. They're all different. So there are precedent-setting cases, all over the U.S. The fact of the matter is, your case may not be able to stand on that individual case law because of whatever the nuances are in that region, whatever the nuances are on that day of the week. So the bottom line that I think we can all agree on is, you know, reasonable prudence, safety, and documentation, right? So, you know, with negligence, and there's another question too, about how do we see COVID-19 impacting business income insurance in the cannabis marketplace? As a program development, you know, professional, my specialty is developing programs for the cannabis space. You know, I write contract language, and I will say honestly, I don't see COVID-19 having a huge impact on the cannabis industry as far as insurance is concerned, because we don't provide coverage in most instances for losses that arise out of a bacteria, fungus, or disease. This is a virus, which is also in that same vein, and it's also a communicable disease. So the cannabis industry and the policies that are written to cover the cannabis industry exclude those things for a reason. Now, I can tell you there is, what is it, HR 6494, a proposed act, which would make business income insurance retroactive for some of these things. You know, something like that could potentially tank the cannabis industry, I'm sorry, the financial and insurance industry. And, you know, we can talk more about that. If you have questions, definitely put them in the chat. Our time is running low here, so any questions that any of the viewers have, please do put them in the chat. Send them to the Q&A section. We will do all that we can to make sure that you get an answer to any of your questions. With us being short on time, I do want to ask.
Summer, that goes to business interruption insurance too, right? And so that's generally unavailable to any of the cannabis businesses.
So business interruption insurance is definitely available, but it's not intended to cover. It's intended to cover direct physical damage to covered property.
Okay.
So you know, fire, wind, you know, anything that's a direct physical loss to covered property. You know what I mean? So theft, or take your, you know what I mean? It's not meant to cover, you know, and I could go real deep into the lingo and things like that. But, you know, bacteria, virus, disease, anything that's could potentially be an inherent property in a product is not intended to be covered. So with all the case laws and things, the definition of, what is it? I said physical damage. The definition of direct physical damage is kind of up in the air. If you can redefine that, then, oh, but I thought I lost you there. I was like, whoa, where'd it go? If you can redefine that, then you will redefine the validity of coverage. But I know that we are running low on time. And one of the important things that I did want to touch on is equity. You know, the war on drugs created quite a few conditions that were disproportionately harsh on people of color and disproportionately harsh on poor people. So one of the things about the cannabis industry is the fact that this industry has enacted laws to change that. So Michelle, it looks like we have about 5 more minutes here. With the last bit of time, could you talk to us about what equity means in cannabis? You know, I did mention too that the SBA loans exclude people with felonies, and you know, they exclude some nonprofits as well, but most importantly, people with felonies. So if you have a system that's been in place that has disproportionately arrested people for crimes, it's highly likely they had cannabis on them, and it's possible they had other things as well. So can you talk to us about that law, your thoughts there, and anything that our viewers can do to help create change and improve things for our equity candidates?
Sure. So, you know, it's really no secret, I don't think, in 2020 now, that the cannabis industry has a diversity problem. And Summer, you really hit it right on the head there, just with the sheer criminalization of cannabis for the last, you know, 40, or, you know, 50 really, I guess at this point, plus years, or 100 really, if you want, depending on how you want to count it. And, you know, I guess really getting back to this has been illegal for 100 years. And we know that cannabis started out as being illegal to target different communities of color, whether that be Latinx communities or whether that be African-American communities. You know, the war on drugs, whether it be Harry Anslinger's war on drugs or Ronald Reagan's war on drugs, was really based around that idea. And so as a result, the cannabis industry has just not has struggled since it began to combat that issue, because many states wrote into their laws, for years in the past that, if you had, a felony conviction, even in some places, I think way back in the day, it was even misdemeanor convictions. And if you had any of those, then you couldn't be involved in the state legal cannabis industry. Well, I don't know what the thought process behind that was, because I think the only way you're going to find a good cannabis grower is, I think, there's probably a good chance he maybe got caught at one point, not to make light of a very serious situation, but that's sort of how it is. And as a result, we've also seen that translate very much into the financial sector. And we talked about that issue a lot when we were pushing the Safe Banking Act in the House. Of course, now we're doing that in the Senate as we sort of also deal with COVID. But the impetus, behind part of the Safe Banking Act as well was that traditionally entrepreneurs of color have not had access to the same sort of capital that their white counterparts have. And that's just sort of a fact of life. And so, entrepreneurs of color might not have access to the same sort of venture capital as their white counterparts. And therefore that makes them a lot more dependent then on the financial institutions that give out loans. But then again, we know that financial institutions themselves struggle with also applicants of color as well. So it's sort of a perfect storm here for a load of problems. And so that's, again, one of the big reasons safe banking was such a pivotal bill. We're really happy that we've worked with our friends over at MCBA on this and have had their support in sort of dealing with this as well. And so last week, some of you may have seen, there's a group called the Marijuana Justice Coalition. That's a group of over 100 different associations, including groups like the Drug Policy Alliance, the ACLU, the Leadership Council. So some really, really well-known names nationally and especially here in Washington. And they all penned a letter to both House and Senate leadership that essentially said, you need to make sure that you give the cannabis industry access to these SBA funds so that communities of color who are already struggling to get involved in the cannabis industry are not thrown back even more so. And so that's what we're going to keep pushing for. And again, I think it really just comes back to not only that SBA access that we've been talking about and the relief that cannabis businesses, whether they be direct or indirect, so desperately need, but also that safe banking piece, because, something that we're really starting to talk about in Washington, I shouldn't say start talking about it, I've been talking about it more for weeks now, but is just the fact of, okay, well, maybe I'm successful, or the cannabis industry and all of us lobbyists are successful in allowing the Small Business Administration to give these funds to cannabis businesses, but how are you going to get your 7A or your EIDL loan if you don't have a bank account? And so these two issues are really intrinsically linked, and one can't go without the other one. And so I think you're completely right, Summer. I think that it is critical, especially now during coronavirus, that we don't forget that this is such an important part of the cannabis industry, or of what needs to be a part of the cannabis industry. And we can't forget that solely because we're dealing with the pandemic.
Thank you so much. Everything that everyone has contributed was so meaningful, so great. And I really, I personally appreciate all of your time, investment, and comments, as I know NCIA does, and the rest of our viewers. I know that we are running short here on time, and we could probably geek out on this topic for hours and hours. So I do just want to once again say thank you to everyone, and to all of our viewers. Please do feel free to ask any questions that you may have. I do have also information on equity. So if you or someone lives in an area, zip code, that has been disproportionately affected by the war on drugs, or you or someone has a cannabis related conviction and is looking to get into the space, we need more people, we need more bodies, investment in the growth and success of our industry. So please do, if you have an interest, send us a message in the chat as well. And so that will conclude our discussion today. Everyone, thank you so much. This has been great.
Thank you, Summer. Thanks for putting this together. This was really fun.
Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you all so much for such a great presentation that not only was timely, but very up to date. As we all know, all of these information regarding these programs seems to be changing day to day. So thank you all so much for providing that part 2 to the risk management series for all of our NCIA members and supporters. Why don't we all give these fantastic panelists a virtual round of applause by posting a quick thank you message in the chat room and let them know what the best piece of information that you're taking away from today's presentation is. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we will conclude the webinar with just a few housekeeping announcements about our upcoming events and activities and a quick preview for next week's and this week's Industry Essentials webinars that are taking place. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, all of you all will receive a PDF version of this presentation immediately upon conclusion of the webinar. You can use this contact information slide, which we have displayed in order to reach out directly, as some are directed all of you all to. If you have any follow-up questions or interest in getting involved in the industry, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of the panelists and do so. All right. And then also one quick note, you all will receive a formatted video recording of this presentation within the next 72 hours. So stay on the lookout for an email, and please do complete the post-event survey, which will be prompted through Zoom to all of you all at the conclusion of this webinar to gain access to that video recording. All right, in case you missed it, we have decided to postpone our upcoming 7th annual Cannabis Business Summit and Expo from June until the end of September. This decision wasn't made lightly. However, NCIA's primary goal throughout this COVID-19 crisis is protecting the health and safety of our community and the nation at large. Head to cannabisbusinesssummit.com to sign up to receive all the exciting news we'll be releasing in the coming weeks, including a very special keynote speaker we can't wait to tell you about, and some exciting developments for any product brand hoping to make a big splash on the expo floor this year. This will surely be a can't miss event and one we'll all desperately need on the other end of this crisis. So as soon as you're able to commit to traveling to an in-person trade show later this year, sign up to ensure you are at the epicenter of the cannabis industry this fall. Additionally, we have also postponed our 10th annual Cannabis Industry Lobby Days until this fall as well. However, along with that postponement, we have also made a number of structural changes to the event, which will provide a more all-inclusive experience to the NCIA members, volunteering their valuable time to our efforts. Admission, which is still just a nominal fee, will now cover the cost for all attendees to participate in our welcome reception, breakfast training, and our new closing celebration in support of the NCIA PAC. We'll also be hosting the 2nd edition of our new VIP Day, which provides even more access and opportunities to participate in historic moments on Capitol Hill with fellow cannabis industry leaders, as well as our congressional champions. We're hoping to bring together all those who have participated in the past decade, as well as hundreds of newcomers this year to celebrate the 10th anniversary of our organization and all the historic progress we've made together. So mark your calendars. Today, as the most impactful 2 days for cannabis industry advocacy, will now be held from September 15th to September 17th, and you can register at the cannabisindustry.org/2020 lobby days. Have you or your business felt the pinch from a lack of exposure at in-person events these past few weeks and months? Well, you're not alone, and NCIA is here to assist. I'm super excited to announce we've just released a wealth of digital marketing sponsorship packages across all of our highly trafficked platforms, including opportunities to be a part of these NCIA Industry Essential webinars. Head to our website to learn more and schedule a meeting with one of our biz dev team to discuss in more detail today. And last but not least, I would like to formally invite all of you to attend the next 2 editions of our ever-expanding Industry Essentials educational webinar series. NCIA's Industry Essentials are our new weekly educational series featuring a variety of programs, allowing us to provide you timely, engaging, and essential education when you need it the most. Next up on Wednesday morning, we have the 2nd edition of our Policy Council Conversation Series, featuring insights and invaluable content directly from members of NCIA's Policy Council, the preeminent think tank for the cannabis industry. This edition will be moderated by Karen Bernstein and feature panelists Christopher Passarelli, Max Schnurrenberger, and Ross Gordon, presenting a session entitled Protecting Your Cannabis Brand. Next week on Monday afternoon, we have the third edition of our NCIA Committee Insights series, showcasing content produced in partnership with one of our 13 member-led committees. This edition will be hosted by our State Regulations Committee and moderated by Maureen McNamara, featuring panelists Greg Huffaker, Michael Cooper, and Margot Bruner, presenting a session entitled Illinois Market, What's Happening and What's Next. Both of these sessions are free for both NCIA members as well as non-members to attend. So if you haven't already, please head to NCIA's website to sign up today and invite as many of your colleagues who might be interested as well. Finally, thank you all so much for participating in another NCIA Industry Essentials educational webinar. Our advocacy, educational, and community building work wouldn't be possible without the hard work and dedication of our nearly 2,000 NCIA member businesses. So thank you for the support of our efforts over this past decade. If you're not already a member of NCIA, do consider joining today by heading to www.thecannabisindustrY.org/join after the conclusion of this webinar. And with that, I hope you all enjoy a wonderful week, and I look forward to seeing you all again this Wednesday for the next edition of NCIA's Industry Essentials educational webinars. Have a great day. Thank you so much.